Time for our message. Eddie told me I need to wait until he turns the camera on until I say something. So, I've been given the thumbs up, so thank you. We're going to continue a series of sermons today. No more than 7, though the Spirit may tell me I need to do more of the 59 than just 7. So actually, I'm doing a little trickery here today. In the scripture lessons you're going to hear, in addition to the main one, we're going to have probably at least 3 other one another sayings. So while you're getting primarily one, and that is about living in harmony with one another, there are several others that really speak to that same theme. So I'll be referring to some others as well this morning. But there's one thing you might not know. Actually, probably some of you already knew this. This theme of harmony in the Bible, or harmony for Christians living together, actually comes from a passage in the book of Acts. And that is in Acts chapter 2, verse 1. And this is actually shows how the Honda Corporation got the name of one of their vehicles. You've probably heard this verse before. And when the day of Pentecost was fully come, the disciples were all in one accord. So think about that for a while. Yes, Honda got their name for the Honda Accord from Acts chapter 2, verse 1. But while we're going to be talking about harmony today, I'm not going to try to get all of you into one car out there in the parking lot. But I do hope, and I think this is probably already true about this congregation, and certainly most of us gathered here, if not all of us gathered here, we are living in harmony with one another, but we could always improve, right? There's always room for improvement. So this second in this series of sermons on the one another commands in the New Testament is based primarily on this passage from Romans 12, verse 16. And that verse reads, Paul says, live in harmony with one another. But he says more than that, because this is also important to being able to live in harmony. He says, do not be proud, but be willing to associate with people of low position. Do not be conceited. So let me read that one verse again. Paul says, live in harmony with one another. That's an imperative, right? A command. This is something that we as Christians ought to do or must do. And in order to do that, we must therefore not be proud, and we must be willing to associate with people of low position. So therefore, Paul says, for living in harmony, we won't be conceited. That is the message of the Apostle Paul there in that particular verse. And we'll hear from him and Peter as well again in a few moments. And thinking about this sermon on harmony, I discovered something on your church website, on the homepage. And at the very bottom of the homepage, there it lists your motto, which you see on the screen. How many of you were aware that you had a church motto? I would just like to know. And maybe it will be helpful for the Pastor Search Committee to know that you actually know what your motto is. And also perhaps for you to think about during this pastor search process, is this still appropriate to be your motto? And what is a motto anyway? That's a question. Anyone can answer. What is a motto? Something to live by. A guiding principle. I don't know if any of you were in the Marines or had a loved one in the Marines, but do you know the motto of the Marines? Semper Fidelis, which means always faithful. Always faithful to your fellow soldiers, or in this case Marines, of course. Always faithful to your country. Always faithful to being successful along with your comrades in the next battle. That's the guiding principle of Marines, and you list this on your website as your guiding principle. And it reads, as you see, in essentials, unity. In non-essentials, liberty. In diversities, love. In all things, Christ first. That you say, at least according to your website. And believe me, any pastors who might become interested in perhaps becoming pastor of your church, no doubt will look at your website. And one thing you want to make sure about your website, not only for any pastoral candidates, but for anyone who might want to investigate this congregation before they come to visit, they will likely, if they're all internet savvy, want to look at your website. This is your introduction to the world about who you are as Colonial Park Community Baptist Church. So one thing they will see at the, I believe it is, at the bottom of your homepage, this is your motto. You're saying to the world, these words guide our life together. This is who we are. This is how we interact and live with each other. And therefore, what is, in many ways, what is most important to us that you need to know about our congregation. Some of you may be aware this motto is a revised version of something that was written 1,600 years ago by St. Augustine, or St. Augustine. He was one of the early Christian leaders. He was actually an Egyptian. And 400 BC, or excuse me, 400 AD, Egypt was still a Christian country. The Muslim religion didn't begin for another 200 years. So unless you were some pagan in the Middle East, you were a Christian. So this was first written as in essentials unity, in non-essentials liberty, and in all things love. That was the original version, which at some point your church modified to fit your church situation and what you believe was essentially your guiding principle for how you will do church and how you will be Colonial Park Baptist Church together. So in many ways, I think this says we are a church who will live in harmony with each other for many different reasons and in many different ways, especially since in all things, Christ will be first. Christ will be first. And if Christ is first, then if he truly is in our hearts and lives, then everything else will work together harmoniously. So this says to me, and I would hope it would say to any pastoral candidates, that this is a church that no matter how small differences there may be among us, you will live in harmony with one another. You will not let small differences sabotage this church and your witness. You will celebrate your differences that should and can serve to make you stronger. Our diversities can make us stronger, right? You may or may not agree with that. You can think about that. You don't have to answer right away. You can celebrate the differences among you. And therefore, you will not allow the differences among you to lead you to be at odds with each other, working at cross purposes, not living and working in silos. And that's an important concept. Any of you ever seen a silo? I think there are a lot of them around here, right? A lot of them, depending on where you drive, just about it. You drive anywhere, at least out of the city, and you're going to see some silos. So think of a silo. It's standing there by itself, right? It's not really, in most cases, and I don't know all the mechanics of silos or groups of silos, but at least the appearance is they're just standing alone. I remember that song, The Cheese Stands Alone. But a church is not a group of silos, is it? We're all connected to each other. And forgive me, I'm thinking of all the illustrations I've used in all my sermons for the last 46 years, and I think I need to share another one with you that's related to silos. You know redwoods, right? Those great big trees out in California, or maybe there may be in some other western states too. What an amazing thing about redwoods is that their root system is very shallow. Maybe you knew this. Their root system is very shallow. So it would make sense that those, especially the storms that California and the West Coast have been getting lately, all those strong winds should topple them over. They have very little root system. But you know what holds them strong and tall and straight? All their root systems are connected to each other. They hold each other up. They're not like silos that aren't connected and sort of, one silo is doing one thing over here and not really caring about or connected with what another person is doing over here in their own personal silos. Yes, you're all different, but you're all connected. The roots are together and you are working in harmony. So your differences actually can, and I hope and pray and probably are, your differences are creating a sweet, inviting, and I would almost say an enchanting melody that for others to hear and want to be drawn to you. Of course, harmony is not always easy given our differences. And actually, many of the things that cause disharmony in the church are those diversities. And they really shouldn't, as far as I'm concerned. But harmony has always been a challenge throughout the history of the church. Just two quick examples in the New Testament. In the book of Acts, we know Paul and Barnabas were the two great missionaries. They went out on 3 missionary journeys. And in their first missionary journey, they also took along a young man by the name of John Mark. And most people believe that John Mark is the one who wrote the Gospel of Mark. But Mark, on that first missionary journey, wasn't very faithful. You know what he did? Halfway through the journey, he bailed on them. Left them high and dry. And Paul was kind of disturbed about that, so as they were beginning their second missionary journey, and John Mark had sort of reappeared, Barnabas, whose name means son of encouragement, wanted to take him along. Paul said, no, his past history shows we can't trust him. He's not, he's not, you can't count on him. So Paul and Barnabas had this big feud, and Paul decided, well, I'll go on my own journey, and I'll take Silas with me, and if you really want him, you can have John Mark. So at that point, there was a division between Paul and Barnabas. They went off on different missionary journeys with different people to help. Also in the church of Philippi, one of the most beloved churches of Paul, one of the more faithful ones, Paul writes in his letter that there are 2 women who are having a fight with each other. And Paul is surprised about that because both of them had worked side by side with him for the sake of the gospel. He says in that book that these 2 women's names are written in the book of life. And what in the world are you doing fighting with each other, bickering about things and differing with each other? You can do so much for the kingdom of God, so why can't you find a way to get along with each other? So those are just 2 examples from the Bible where it has been difficult to maintain harmony. And harmony is no easier today. Maybe you've had or heard stories and maybe even experienced stories in your own church life over the years about churches having difficulties. Some churches have fought over what color the carpet should be in the sanctuary. That's never happened. Well, I don't know how long you've had this carpet, but I don't know if there was a fight over choosing the color. Or there have really been some big fights when a kitchen committee, and I don't think you have a kitchen committee necessarily here, but when the kitchen needed painting, what color? That could be a problem sometimes. And I heard of one church where the roof needed to be replaced. It was an asphalt shingle roof, and they couldn't decide on what color to get the shingles. So they decided, and actually this was a good solution, I guess. One half of the roof was colored with one shingle, and the other half with the other. And whichever color you wanted the shingles to be, that's the side of the church you sat on in worship service. But perhaps one of the worst I saw firsthand was in a church where a choir director had left some years ago, and now they were in search of another choir director. And the choir really wanted to recall the choir director they'd had several years ago, but the church did not vote to call him back. And you know what the choir did? They went on strike. Literally. They refused to sing. And you know what developed? Well, there were some other volunteers out in the sanctuary, in the congregation, who decided they were going to be the scab choir. And no doubt you've heard of scabs, like in union strikes, and people who come in and work and get a job when the other workers are on strike. Well, that church had a scab choir for several months before the original choir decided it was time to come back. Hopefully you haven't had too many experiences like that here, or anything close to that, hopefully. But too often, the things that cause disharmony are over really insignificant things in the grand scheme of God's eternal plan for us, aren't they? It's sort of ridiculous, certainly. But while, given our human nature, harmony might seem like an idealistic dream, Paul believes it's possible. And when you experience harmony, it's one of the most wonderful things you can experience in the church. So how do we do that? Well, let's look specifically at our lessons for today. We really need to know exactly what does Paul mean when he asks us to live in harmony. Well, those words translated there in the New International Version are really just an attempt not to directly translate specific words, but the idea of harmony, because in the Greek language, there is no exact word that is translated harmony. So what is Paul trying to say? What is the idea behind the Greek words there that the New Testament, or excuse me, the English translation translates as harmony? So Paul basically says we need to have the same mind, or be like-minded, or be of one mind. Now that doesn't mean that we all have the same opinions on every single issue. I've shared with some of you, my experience with Baptists is that when you get two Baptists together, you're going to have at least 3 different opinions on any one subject. That's just the nature of Baptists I've found in my lifetime. So when Paul says we have to be of one mind, that doesn't mean that we all have to have the same opinions on every single subject. Doesn't mean we have the same hobbies or the same personalities. Remember your motto. We're going to have some diversities, right? And in those diversities, we're going to have love for each other. And that really is the attitude, right? We're going to love each other no matter what. We are committed first of all to Christ, and therefore we're also going to be committed to all those other people who are just like me, also committed to Jesus Christ. So we have first in our minds Christ and His will for us, and our commitment to each other. Remember last week I said the best definition of Christian fellowship is to be as committed to each other as we are to Jesus Christ. We're committed to Him and the mission He has for us, and we're all in this together, working together. So let's look also at a few verses that build on this idea of living in harmony or being like-minded. Another verse, and this is actually from Peter, from 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 8. There Peter says, "Finally, all of you live in harmony with one another." And this is what he says specifically about what that will look like. He says, we will be sympathetic. We will love as brothers, and we will be compassionate and humble. So 2 words there I think are most important for us in how we live in harmony. We need to be sympathetic and compassionate. Sympathetic and compassionate. What do those 2 words mean? Well, at least we know them here in our head, but we need to know them in our hearts. Actually, we need to know them as what literally Paul is using there. We need to know them in our guts. So let me explain. The word translated compassion here comes from a word that literally means to strengthen from the spleen. That's the literal meaning of the Greek word there. To strengthen from the spleen. In other words, it refers to our internal organs. And this is why the King James Version translates this. We need the bowels of compassion. The bowels of compassion. Now, we don't normally associate the bowels with and compassion, but what the Greek words were trying to communicate to us is that they view the internal organs of the abdomen as the seat of our emotions. So look at it this way. When it comes to compassion, we just feel something welling up inside of us. Something welling up inside of us, urging us to reach out to help. Just coming from deep within us. And the word translated sympathetic here means to suffer with or to have a fellow feeling. Peter isn't talking just about a few kind words, but we are to feel for each other way down deep, or we might say in our feelers. Now that's somewhat like that old saying, you need to walk a mile in another's shoes or another's moccasins. But it's more than that. It's to genuinely try to feel and experience what that other person is feeling and experiencing. How does it really seem to them? How do they see it? How does it feel to be where they are? And that's how we need to think about each other, especially when maybe we are having differences, or when we are noticing the diversities among us. Where are they coming from? What life experiences have they had that have brought them to think the way they're thinking or to act the way that they are acting? And there really is something about people suffering together, really feeling the same way that other people are feeling. People who have had a common experience really find that they are bound together, no matter what differences they might have. Let me tell you something about what happened during World War II in London. Some polls were taken just a few years ago among Londoners who lived through the Nazi Blitz of the 1940s. And believe it or not, a large majority of those who were surveyed said those were the best days of our lives. They actually recall those days of sheltering in bomb shelters under the city with fondness and nostalgia. How could that be? Well, remember, Britain stood all alone after the fall of France before the United States entered the war. At one point, 1,500 German planes bombed London for 52 straight nights. I don't guess that's quite as bad. That's probably worse so far than what Ukraine has experienced. Londoners feared invasion by Germany every day across the city. Yet one doctor who helped tend to the wounded in those days describes the strong bonds of community that developed among the people who were hiding deep within the city in those shelters. He described entire cities of people living underground, having dinner, feeding their babies, laughing and telling jokes, and sleeping on mats. Rich and poor alike were gathered together there, and there their political differences didn't matter. When they had lived, where they had lived in London didn't matter. Above ground, they were losing everything, but below ground, they were one. They were one. In some ways, isn't that what the church should be in the world? We're like a bomb shelter from the ravages of sin and shattered dreams. We offer refuge from broken relationships and the crushing pressure of the rat race. We can be that when we have sympathy and compassion for one another. You and I can create a harmony that unites us regardless of whatever else might otherwise divide us. Now, another ingredient in harmony is found in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 5, where Peter says, and this also relates to what we just heard from that previous verse. Here Peter says, clothe yourselves with humility toward one another. That's 1 Peter 5:5. Clothe yourselves with humility toward one another. This doesn't mean that you basically allow yourself to be treated like a doormat. And it doesn't mean that you put on humility like you put on a shirt for a while and then take it off. Humility, Peter is saying, is not a costume. Clothe literally means to tie on, to cinch it up, to tie it with a knot. So humility doesn't come naturally to us by nature. Many of us are full of ourselves. And some of us don't know that. Or we're unaware of the fact that we are full of ourselves. We easily give way to pride and have way too high an opinion of ourselves. Humility is something we must put on, but it isn't easy. We have to tie it on and cinch it in place, lest we take it off, or somehow it slips off. And let's think of the word humble, or humility. To be humble means, or has the idea of being lowly or insignificant. Peter isn't telling us to have poor self-esteem or to lack self-confidence. It's a call to have a correct opinion about ourselves. So who are we actually? In our prayer, I mentioned the fact that, guess what? You and I aren't God. Any surprise? But sometimes people might mistake us for thinking we are, like we're in charge of everything. Like people might say, who died and left you, God? Some people, I don't know, any of you ever heard that or said that? You don't have to answer that question. But you see, pride and low self-esteem have something in common. And that is they both put all the focus on ourselves. It's all about the great Trinity. It's not God, the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. It's me, myself, and I. True humility and this is an important distinction, okay? True humility is not thinking less of yourself. You hear that? True humility is not thinking less of yourself. True humility is thinking of yourself less. You see the difference? True humility is thinking of yourself less, not thinking less of yourself. It's realizing who you are. You're a creature of God, made from the dust of the earth. I think the word humility comes from the same root word as humus, which is not hummus, but humus, which is dirt, right? It's the soil. That's what God made us from, right? The dust of the earth. And I'm made from that dust, and you're made from that same dust. Now, some people will say, well, that's the same dust that the stars are made from. And yeah, sure, we're all made from stardust, but we are all made from stardust. No one is more glamorous or better than the other. That's who we are. We're dust. We're not God. We're all equal in that sense. So true humility, therefore, will think first about the needs of the other and never think that we're more important than the other. Some of you have heard of Leonard Bernstein, right? Great conductor, also a composer. He was once asked which instrument was the most difficult instrument to play. Do you have any opinions about that? Not yet? Haven't tried them all yet, right? Not all. Well, Leonard Bernstein answered that question in this way. He said the most difficult instrument to play is second fiddle. Think about that. He said, I get plenty of first violinists, and probably those who want to be, but to find someone who can play the second fiddle with enthusiasm, that's a problem. And if we have no second fiddle, he said, we have no harmony. Now, I'm not a musician, never played in an orchestra. I only have some sense of what that means. It means they don't play necessarily the most prominent part, or at least they're not sitting in the front chair, or first chair. And there's probably more to it than that. But obviously, I believe, first fiddle always is the one that must be the best. And therefore, if you're second fiddle, you're sort of in second place. Or you're the bench warmer. None of us, or at least Bernstein said, no one really wants to be second fiddle. But if you're going to have true harmony, you need first fiddle, you need second fiddle, and if there are third fiddles or whatever, you need us all. And one definition I read of harmony is that it's basically at least two or maybe at least three notes played together at the same time. And I guess harmony can be good or bad. But the harmony we want is for it to sound good, to be pleasant, and that's what harmony, that's the type of harmony we're looking for in the church. Yes, we're all different notes. Like we're all different notes on the piano keyboard. But when we're played right and when we sound right, not blowing our own horn, when we're playing together, and therefore in harmony we create that sweet melody that's inviting to all others and makes life sweet and pleasant for us and draws others to us. And that's what Paul is calling us to do. And this one last verse, submit one to one another out of reverence for Christ. Willingly and humbly place yourself into position for the good of the whole. Whether that's first fiddle or second fiddle, you're all just as important. And when we Christians willingly submit, willingly line ourselves up under each other, we can have harmony in the body of Christ, and we can move forward together in the cause of Christ. And then one last one another. And this is probably the longest sermon I've ever preached, so I better hurry up. One last one another, accept one another. Let me just tell you quickly, and we're going to get to this verse in a second, so keep that one up. When you invited Jesus Christ into your heart, you know what he did? He invited all of his other friends to come with him. Think of that. When we invite Jesus into our hearts, Jesus brings all of his other friends with him. So accept one another. There are Jesus' friends, and of course there are your brothers and sisters. So finally look at this passage as Paul sort of sums up hopefully much of what I've tried to say today. Be completely humble and gentle. Be patient, bearing with one another in love. Make every effort to keep the unity of the Spirit through the bond of peace. There is one body and one Spirit, just as you were called to be one hope. You were called to one hope when you were called. One Lord, one faith, one baptism, one God and Father of all, who is over all and through all and in all. In other words, Christ first. So what unites us, friends, is far greater than what could ever divide us. What unites us are the one Lord who died for us, the one faith that saves us, the one baptism that joins us all with Christ's death and fills us with His Spirit, the one God whose plan and purpose is guiding the whole thing. Those things are greater than all the things that we might get offended by or hurt over. We have many more reasons to get and stay together than to stay apart and maybe sulk or throw barbs, degrade each other, or ignore each other. So my friends, today, let's recommit ourselves to your motto. Let's rejoice in our diversity that gives rise to the beautiful sounds of the love of God in Christ Jesus living in us. And may many of those who live here in Harrisburg and the suburbs nearby hear that sound of our harmony and be drawn to Christ. Friends, let's be known as God's people. In a moment, we'll be singing our hymn, We Are Called to Be God's People. But before we sing that, I want to suggest to read the very first verse. And Eddie will have that verse up for me in just a minute. As we sing this, let's really commit ourselves not just, of course, to this first verse, but to this whole song, which talks about the need for our harmony. We are called to be God's people, showing by our lives His grace, one in heart and one in spirit. We are the sign of hope for all the race. So let us show how He has changed us and remade us as His own. Let us share our life together as we shout around His throne. So let's stand together, if you're able, as we sing